The nice thing about science is that it's an equal opportunity way of knowing knowing about the natural world, independent of what ideology you bring into it. But we all do follow this practice of restricting ourselves to natural causes. And it's not because all scientists are atheists. It's because of a basic limitation of science that we like to test our ideas,
yeah.
all right?
That's the way science works.
Yeah, the foundation of science is testing your ideas. Okay, now how do you test something? You learn in 7th grade, if you want to test something, you have to hold constant certain variables, right? If you've got 2 plots and you want to know whether adding fertilizer to this plot of corn makes it grow better, what you have to do is hold constant the amount of water that each plot gets, the amount of cultivation, the amount of bugs that affect it, the amount of sunlight, you know, so that the only thing that would make this plot of corn grow taller is the fertilizer.
Yeah.
You know, it's scientific control. You hold constant certain variables. All right. God is unconstrained, right? You can't hold constant God. That's why we have to restrict ourselves to natural causes. We can't bring God in as an explanation as the creationists want to do because we can't test statements having to do with God. Any outcome of an experiment is compatible with God's action. The corn plot grew, God wanted it to. The corn plot didn't grow, God wanted it to. You're not learning anything that way.
And you've made a point to not engage or not debate religious people for that very fact, because there's just no way to test those things, and you're more concerned with the things that are testable.
Well, when I'm wearing my scientist hat, yeah, I mean, we're trying to understand the natural world. We have to use only natural causes. My friend Bill Thwaites had a wonderful line, which I've stolen and used many times. We don't have a theometer. If we ever get a theometer, then we can bring God in as an explanation. We don't have a theometer. We're not likely to get one. So we have to just stumble along best we can with natural causes, which doesn't mean that science is an inherently atheistic procedure. Or if it does, it means that it's equally atheistic as long division. Because, you know, we use an algorithm, we use natural process, so to speak, to compute long division problems as well. Nobody thinks that's atheistic. You shouldn't think science is atheistic just because it restricts itself to natural cause.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to keeping the religious ideas and creationism out of the science classrooms, you've been doing this for a long time, somewhere between 25 years and a quarter century.
I think that's the same thing, but never mind.
Just
making sure I was listening, weren't you?
The point is, the point is, you've been doing this a long time, and I know from a little bit of the research that I've done on it that it wasn't, in the beginning, they just came out and said, we want to teach creationism in the classroom. And it's sort of evolved over the years. It's gone from that to something else, to intelligent design, to strengths and weaknesses. And I think the evolution of the creationist movement, so to speak, is part of your talk tonight here at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. Can you talk a little bit about the early form of creationism? How did they try to get it into the schools?
Well, you gave a really good summary. If I get, you know, if I come down with swine flu this afternoon or something, I'll give you my slides. You can take over. Well, of course, the very first effort back in the days of John Scopes was to just ban evolution completely. I mean, that was, you know, and it was highly successful for quite a few decades. But when evolution started coming back into the curriculum, that's when the creationists geared up again. And indeed, their first argument was, well, we'll just teach the Bible alongside it. And the courts made pretty quick work of that, because the way the First Amendment is interpreted, the religion clause, is that public institutions like schools have to be religiously neutral. You can't promote religion, you can't inhibit religion, you've got to be neutral. And if you're teaching creationism as valid science, that's promoting religion, so clearly that's not going to go anywhere. Then they invented creation science, which was taking creationism and claiming that you could find scientific evidence for it.
And that's just a marketing ploy, right? It had the word science right there in it, so that's how they thought they were going to get away with it.
It's a marketing ploy, but they also are very sincere in believing that this is supportable through science.
And that was, I'm sorry, that was in the early 80s, right, the creation science?
That was the 60s.
The 60s.
I mean, this goes back. Creation science got rolling back in the early to mid 1960s with the publication by Henry Morris, the great Henry Morris Sr., of the Genesis flood, which was an attempt to take the Bible story of the world being totally covered by water, and all creatures on the earth today, the descendants of the creatures that were on the ark, the human and animals, and claimed that there was scientific evidence for that by looking in geological strata and so forth. It's loopy for science, of course, but there's this whole book, and this is really what launched the idea of creation science. And it's an idea actually that was extant in the late 1800s as well. There were the scriptural geologists, they call themselves. It's a really interesting history where they tried to prove that the earth was young and that the flood had actually occurred and so forth. And some of the same ideas actually were just resurrected by Morris and his 20th century predecessors. So it's kind of an interesting history that Ronald Numbers goes into. But then came creation science. That was also tested in the courts in the late 60s.
I was thinking 82,
87.
McLean versus Arkansas Board of Education, and in 87 was Edwards versus Aguilar.
Right.
And coincidentally, or maybe it was tied together, in 87 is when you became executive director of the National Center for Science Education. Were you involved in those cases at all?
No, actually I wasn't. I was, well, tangentially in Edwards because I was working with some of the people who were expert witnesses and people who were involved in this thing, but not directly. No. By the time I became,
but you were certainly getting revved up at that time.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I was clear. I was following these cases all along. That was, I mean, I was still an academic at that point. I'm glad you mentioned McLean because McLean is a case that a lot of people don't know about. It preceded the Supreme Court decision, but it was a separate lawsuit involving the passage of a law in Arkansas that would require that if you teach evolution, you have to teach creation science to balance it out. Of course, balance is the big deal. And of course, that was the same sort of law that was passed in Louisiana that eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court in Edwards. But the McLean case is a very interesting one because it was actually a full trial. The plaintiffs, by the way, were largely religious organizations. Reverend Bill McLean was the Methodist, the head of the Methodist church in Little Rock. And the other plaintiffs were also leaders of religious denominations, which was a very clever way of framing this, because they wanted to be sure that this did not look like science versus religion. They wanted to frame this clearly as a First Amendment establishment of religion case. And of course, all of these Methodists and Presbyterians, and actually Southern Baptists, they were not as crazy as they are today, but Southern Baptists were one of the plaintiffs.
But they were well on their way.
Yeah, it didn't take, it was only a couple years later that they fell from grace, as it were. But all these religious denominations didn't want that law to be implemented because that means that kids would learn biblical literalism Monday through Friday, and then they'd have to straighten them out on the weekends because that wasn't their theology. So they definitely had a reason to protest this law. But very famous scientists were brought in by the plaintiffs in this case, people like Stephen Jay Gould and Brent Dalrymple, and
sure.
I mean,
and then after this, creation science goes away in that incarnation anyway.
It goes away as a legal strategy.